Hello, I'm Franco Marucci, a retired professor at the University of Venice Ca' Foscari, and I'm going to talk to you about my recent book, George Eliot's The Lifted Veil, a Sequential and Contextual Reading, Routledge 2022. This is the book. After years of unrelenting study and having published in the past 15 years 3 essays on the lifted veil, I realized that much more needed to be said on it, and that the numerous essays available left some notable lacunae. My book is almost surely, one of course can never know, the first written in any language on this intriguing, enigmatic, mysterious story by George Eliot. My book is not, of course, definitive. No book is definitive. But while it applies and improves on some of the existing approaches, it explores for the first time several textual implications that have never been discussed. Now, the widespread view until half a century ago was that the lifted veil was anomalous and that it stood apart from George Eliot's remaining oeuvre. Published in 1859 in Blackwoods, its republication was deferred until 1878. George Eliot was, however, aware that the lifted veil touched on essential aspects of her writing. She said, "I care for the idea which it embodies and which justifies its painfulness," she admitted. The 1878 reprint in the Cabinet edition, a collected edition of her works until then, led to the first major appraisal of the lifted veil by Henry James. Henry James's perplexities persisted for almost half a century, until critics slowly came to sense that the story belonged to George Eliot's best art, although they remained baffled and failed to categorize it completely within George Eliot's macrotext. Henry James himself had lamented, quote, "a want of a connection between the clairvoyance of the hero and the incident," implying that the 2 chapters of the story present 2 independent series of imaginative issues and attain very different aesthetic results. Writing as late as 1991, the George Eliot scholar K.M. Newton could state that the lifted veil had by then to be regarded, some 150 years after publication, as an integral part of George Eliot's oeuvre and not as a strange anomaly. My book tries to prove precisely this, that far from being anomalous, the lifted veil belongs crucially to George Eliot's macrotext. More than this, the lifted veil is, in my view, the linchpin of this macrotext. And what George Eliot wrote before it paves the way to it, while at the same time the lifted veil reverberates through George Eliot's novels following it. Indeed, it contains indications of an imminent change of direction in George Eliot's aesthetics. Now, for this talk to be understood, maybe a summary of the contents of the story is needed. These are its bare bones Latimer, first name, he has given no surname, is an English motherless adolescent with poetic tastes, whose father sends him to Geneva, where he becomes friends with a certain Charles Meunier, a promising student of medicine. In Geneva, Latimer, among other things, discovers that he can read the thoughts of other people and even predict the future. He also falls in love with his brother's fiancée, one Bertha. This brother suddenly dies, and Latimer marries Bertha, but the marriage rapidly falls apart and she wishes to poison him. This is prevented by a maid in Latimer's household. This maid dies, but is temporarily revived by means of a blood transfusion made by Meunier, Latimer's former friend in Geneva. This maid has just the time, before dying, to reveal, before dying definitively, she has just the time to reveal Bertha's secret plan of poisoning her husband. The story ends with Latimer's death, proving that his initial prediction, which he communicates at the beginning of the story, a month earlier, was true. The story is told in the form of a first-person memoir. The huge body of recent essays on the lifted veil is highly diversified according to where the emphasis of the story is placed. My introduction lists and briefly discusses the main approaches. A, genetic, that is focusing on the lifted veil as a transposition of George Eliot's recent biography and on Latimer's literary and real-life models. B, mesmeric and or in a broader sense medical and clinical, that is a reading of the lifted veil against the background of Victorian science and pseudoscience and of the stimulations George Eliot received from the contemporary debate on phrenology, physiology, psychology, medical therapy, spiritualism, and so on. C, new historicist, a viable approximation of an approach that has considerably developed the mesmeric and the medical ones, exploiting the lifted veil in order to sketch the history of medicine in Britain in the decades preceding its publication, rather than the reverse. D, epistemological, interpreting the lifted veil as an attack on the utopias of scientism and as the defense of art as a means to preserve mysteries that science aims to expose and explode. E, feminist, in the footsteps of Gilbert and Goubart, enlarging and often rediscussing the argument. Gilbert and Goubert's book is, of course, thus, The Mad Woman in the Attic. It contains a very long chapter, pioneering chapter on the lifted veil. G, post-structural, deconstructive and aporetic. H, linguistic, stylistic and narratological, focusing on the strategies of both the external and the internal narrator. I, comparative, dealing with the similarities and analogies between the lifted veil and previous texts of the English literary tradition, and in particular influencing outstanding later writers. My approach, as the title of the book indicates, is sequential and contextual. A sequential reading of The Lifted Veil seems to be authorized, if not invited, by the nature of the narration. In other words, the use of a mimetic enunciation that simulates a gradual definition, in optical terms as well, of events, places, and characters as they have appeared to the narrating eye in the course of time until the moment of the enunciation. Contextual means placing the lifted veil within George Eliot's oeuvre and against the background of Victorian mid-century fiction. The lifted veil intersects various contemporary genres and subgenres. The title of the story clearly points to its involvement with the literature of the veil of, in particular, American contemporary writers, Hawthorne first and foremost, and with the continental and especially German tradition of the mesmeric tale. At the same time, lacunae is a variation on a frequent icon in British poetry and fiction of the period, that of the psychologically disturbed and displaced intellectual at odds with his family and growing up in a moment when new educational systems were about to be adopted and the humanities were losing their primacy and their appeal. The second chapter in The Lifted Veil revolves around a more conventional archetypal icon, that of the femme fatale, and around the lethal power of inextinguishable erotic desire, another constant in George Eliot and other Victorian male and female writers. Now, the organization of my book is as follows: introduction, 4 chapters, and bibliography. But a useful aid for readers is the inclusion of the text of The Lifted Veil at the end of the book with numbered paragraphs. Given the meticulousness of my investigation, the reader would have found it difficult to follow me if I had used, with page references, one of the many editions available, the standard ones being Oxford University Press and Penguin Classics, with excellent introduction and notes by respectively Helen Small and Sally Shuttleworth. This is the Oxford University Press edition of the story, along with Brother Jacob, and this is the Penguin Classics edition, both with Brother Jacob. In this way, the reader can immediately pinpoint the passage and the terms to which I refer, regardless of the edition he or she may have. In chapter 1 of my book, I review George Eliot's biography in the years 1850-1859, and I show that lacunae is a recognizable stand-in for George Eliot herself. I also trace the genesis of the Lifted Veil in some very early prose writings by George Eliot in her 20s, in particular in a sketch of a dreamy, misanthropic writer with only one friend and dying very young. The same situation, in other words, as in The Lifted Veil. I then examine the many links that emerge between The Lifted Veil and the 2 previous George Eliot novels, Adam Bede and The Mill on the Floss. Already in these 2 novels, couples of siblings appear, and in particular the cognitive antithesis is launched between a posteriori sensory knowledge and a priori knowledge of vision. Latimer impersonates the writer who reads into the minds of his or her characters and foresees their actions. The genesis of George Eliot's novels as a visionary trance is confirmed by Eliot herself in her letters and prefaces to the novels. In my sequential reading, my chapter 2 begins with 3 technical sections. As suggested by the title, The Lifted Veil is the leading 19th century British work belonging to a literary tradition revolving around the archetypal image of the lifting or piercing of the veil, a mainly metaphysical veil, with evident influences exerted by the novels and stories by Hawthorne once again. I also devote many pages to interpret the epigraph and to discuss the narratological and tropological organization of the text. In my section entitled Times, Names, Places, I try to decipher what happens to Latimer in Geneva and Prague in chapter 1 of the story. A boat trip on Lake Geneva has a clear epiphanic value for Latimer. The text is vague, but it seems as if he experiences transcendence, a form of transcendence, the sensation of transcendence. Latimer's stay in Prague is in turn the crux of the story. Here, I draw on the work, also translated into English, Praga Magica, Magic Prague, by the Italian scholar of Russian and Czech literature, Angelo Maria Ripellino. What is this? By the way, this is the book by Ripellino, Praga Magica. What is disconcerting about this splendid book, which seems to be an encyclopedia of works related to the myth of Prague, is the absence of any mention of the lifted veil, which is, along with Trollope's Nina Balatka, the only major 19th century British work intermittently or continuously set in Prague. Jewish historians of this myth reconstruct the Prague of Emperor Rudolf II when Prague, and I quote from a work by the French historians André Neher, written Neher, when Prague, as I was saying, was, quote, a small holy land blessed like Palestine, a city that occupies its privileged center, just as at the geometric center of the Holy Land and of the world sits the majesty of Jerusalem, end of quote. The result we may obtain in the light of what happens in Prague to the Latimer of the story is, as I try to prove in my book, that he is about to discover or sense that he is a Jew. If, as I believe, The Lifted Veil is autobiographical, George Eliot herself had early started to entertain the thrilling epiphanic hypothesis that she herself had undocumented Jewish ancestors. While the major scholarly biographies do not take definite stands about the hypothesis of this Jewish extraction, it was rumored by her contemporaries. In Prague, Latimer is led in an extrasensory way to a synagogue where he faces but misses out on his Jewish epiphany. At the end of this visit, misunderstanding or ignoring what is happening to him, he does realize, as he had foreknown and foreseen, that his spiritual pilgrimage would end at a rainbow and a star, two images whose Kabbalistic significance I discuss in my book. But before reaching this conclusion, in my sequential reading I focus, among many other topics, on the events of part 2 of the story. Latimer's extrasensory powers, as we've seen, he reads into the other characters' minds and foresees the future, with the only exception of Bertha, his wife, are elements ascribable to the tradition of the mesmeric tale, though the term mesmeric is not found in the story. Hence the need to reconstruct the history of this literary subgenre and the story's relationships with it. In chapter 4 of my book, George Eliot's following works, Silas Marner, Brother Jacob, Felix Holt, Romola, Middlemarch, and even the Spanish Gypsy, are investigated to see how the motifs of prediction of the two siblings and of the femme fatale reappear in the form of subtle but unmistakable parallelisms and correspondences. A long section is devoted to Bertha as the archetype of the femme fatale and to her representation of one of the roles of the woman in George Eliot. Some women are angelic, some angelic and demonic, like Maggie Tulliver and Partridge Romola, and a few only demonic. Another section discusses in detail the modelling influence of some of Poe's tales on the episode of the blood transfusion and of the maid's reanimation in The Lifted Veil. As I announced, Latimer's failed Jewish epiphany in Geneva and Prague receives an overwhelming confirmation in Daniel Deronda, George Eliot's final novel. And this is the discussion that concludes the book, though a kind of double confirmation comes from the modern hep, hep, hep from Theophrastus such. Now, the atheistic and nihilistic Latimer lets the possibility of a Jewish denouement and of a religious conversion slip away is proved by a subtle, astutely concealed association in the final pages of Daniel Deronda. Deronda, in other terms, explains the mystery of the rainbow and the star in The Lifted Veil by virtue, so to speak, of a retroactive syllogism. Both Latimer and Deronda are formerly English Anglicans, and they are fatally led to visit synagogues, and the latest character's discovery that he's a Jew in circumstances similar to Latimer's verifies the link existing between the two. I argue in my book that Latimer comes closer to his Jewish epiphany in Geneva than in Prague, two messianic cities, but for George Eliot with a different messianic force. Deronda discovers that he is a Jew in Genoa. It is important, in fact revelatory, that this denouement should take place in this city. Geneva and Genova, the Italian name of Genoa, are two name places sharing the same etymology, as well as having the difference of only one letter of the alphabet, or two if we substitute Geneva with the French name Genève for them to be exactly the same. On the other hand, historians tell us that it was Julius Caesar, in his De Bello Gallico, who called the Swiss city Genoa. As a Swiss historian annotates, quote, "This name, similar to that of Genoa or Genova, refers without doubt to the position of the two places at the edge of a nappe d'eau." End of quote. It is often suggested that both names, Genoa and Geneva, have an iconic basis, since the two cities lie on a creek having the form of a knee, genu in Latin. In Italian, this almost perfect sameness of the two names is lost because the Swiss city is called Ginevra. Who knows why? The final result of this syllogism is that Latimer and Deronda respectively reject and recognize their Jewish epiphanies in Geneva and Genova, or Genova, I should say, though George Eliot camouflages this resemblance by anglicizing the name of the Italian city as Genoa. In other words, it is difficult to think of reasons for placing this racial, religious, and spiritual denouement in Genoa or Genova rather than in other European cities, different from that of hinting at the similar denouement that is offered to, but let slip by, similar characters in cities bearing almost the same name. Thank you.